right or left, is what we say as a party. It's about right and wrong. It's about putting in checks and balances so that whoever comes to power, I'm not interested in who comes to power. I'm interested that when they're in power, the aphrodisiac of power corrupts. It does corrupt. It's human nature. But there are checks and balances in place to ensure that we, the people, are protected and the money and the taxes that we pay are not squandered and put into their friends' pockets, and that corruption doesn't spread like a virus around our institutions. So we're there to do systemic change. That is our goal.
On the point of electoral reform, I've read a bit of your sort of pre-draft of your manifesto, and you've spoken about making voting compulsory from 21, about lowering the voting age to 16, about introducing or supporting rather proportional representation, about making sure there's mechanisms so that people can vote online. Where do you think the mark is in terms of introducing more electoral reforms? Because right now we have a two-party system, which I would argue is quite stable. We were able to move through 3 premierships quite swiftly without any sort of havoc, which wouldn't be the case in many other democracies. Why do you think these policies are very important to introduce and are needed for change?
I would say that we have a performative system. We don't really have democracy in this country at all. What we have is two parties who, one comes into power and then the opposition actually has no power. We almost have an autocracy when a government comes in because they control the legislative business of the day. They control everything that happens. This is all a game. This is all performance, question time, all of it. The opposition, we're kidding ourselves if we think we have a democracy. So that's why we need electoral reform, because one voice, one vote should count. And it's the only way that I can see that we rebuild trust and people feel that they're represented. Because the one group of people which are growing in this country ahead of the next election is a group saying they won't vote, they're disenfranchised, they don't believe anything is possible. I mean, that is close to 50% of the electorate at the moment in the polling that you can see. The thing we hear across the country is, what's the point? That is the most common sentiment that's put out there. So if you don't electoral reform is not just right, it's fair, and it's what people deserve. And actually, what is the most disgraceful thing, I believe, is that the Labour Party, 83% of the membership of the Labour Party support proportional representation. It's a parliamentary party that don't want it because it serves them. And the Conservative government will never bring it in because they don't see it. I mean, they've just said that they're not going to allow you under 25 to actually drive somebody in your car. They don't believe in fairness and inclusiveness. And so I think we have to bring in proportional representation because it's the right thing to do. I would actually go as far as not just to say compulsory voting, but I think that the day of voting should be either on a Sunday or a bank holiday and make it Democracy Day, because actually our democracy needs defending.
You speak of the Labour Party, and correct me if I'm wrong, I see a lot of similarities between some of your policies and that of the Labour Party's, namely the House of Lords reforms that you've proposed. So you've proposed getting rid of hereditary peers, having 10-year limits for members of the House of Lords, for reducing the number of seats to 400. Don't you think that contributes to some sort of destabilization in the way our politics works? And don't you think that it would politicize the way appointments work, as we've seen with Prime Minister's appointments? And do you think that it would actually make any effective change to the way the House of Lords already runs?
I would say the House of Lords isn't effectively running at the moment. And actually, I think you'll find Mr. Brown was actually very upset with my response to his proposal, in that I said that his proposals for House of Lords reforms were utopian rather than utilitarian, in that he says he can do it in one parliament and that it goes to a fully elected chamber. But my criticism of his report, and actually the report says that it didn't start with the very most basic and fundamental question, which is we have to decide what is the role of the House of Lords. Because if the answer is that it is a legislative oversight chamber, then that then constitutes, the constitution of that has to reflect that decision. And I believe it is an oversight chamber. And therefore, it needs to have people who can do that role, which is why I say no hereditary peers, no religious individuals. You know, it should be 400 because that's actually the number of seats that are in the House of Lords. So I'm very practical about this, is that you need them all there at one time so they can actually vote and debate. There are other reforms I would bring into the House of Lords, but you cannot separate, you cannot take it away from the lower chamber. This idea that you're going to transport it up north or something like that. It needs to be by the lower chamber. The lower chamber and the upper chamber work together. But it is a very important house, because if you, like this government, not this government, but previous Conservative governments, you know, on the 28th of April last year, there were 9 acts that received royal assent that changed our rights on the streets, in the courts, in the ballot box, you know, the Elections Act, the Judicial Review Act, the Police Act, the Nationality and Borders Act. All of these things changed our rights in our country. They all got through Parliament. They were written in the space of less than a year, some of them. How can that be good law? They push through laws that are going to have huge unintended consequences. I mean, if you look at the moment, their idea of trying to limit our voices on the street, they passed the Police Act, gave the police powers, but people are still demonstrating on the streets because they can't figure out if they actually enforce that act, there'd be 400 people in jail every week. Our prisons can't cope with that. So, you know, they've pushed through bad law, and that's not good for our country.
Speaking of royal assent and law, I want to go back a bit to what people like to call Miller 2, your second...
It's so weird having Miller 1 and 1.
Your second constitutional case that you took to the Supreme Court, which, of course, ruled in your favour unanimously. Do you think that that case sort of showed the practicability of the separation of powers? And do you think that the Supreme Court has too much power? Do you think it doesn't have enough power? Do you think Parliament's sovereignty is enforced at the moment? Do you think Parliament needs to be more sovereign? And what are some of the ways that we can ensure that there are an effective separation of powers?
I think both the cases prove that the separation of powers is alive and well. The whole idea that the courts couldn't put their tanks on political lawns was a load of nonsense, because actually, of course, they can when it's a separation of powers. Because what both cases were about was that we have a representative democracy, and therefore Parliament has to be involved when our rights are changed. You can't just shut down Parliament. That is literally shutting down our democracy. So the courts were right to rule on both the cases, especially when we don't have a written constitution. It's important that they were able to clarify that, that issue about Parliament's sovereignty. So both cases were actually about the same thing, even though there was different cases and different prime ministers. But that is a fundamental cornerstone of our democracy, is that Parliament is sovereign. That is the way we work. We elect our representatives, and they must be part of the process when our rights are going to be changed. So it was right that we took that case. I think it was disgraceful, the way the politicians and certain media politicized the courts and the judgments and the names they called, you know, enemies of the people. I mean, you're going back to, that was the most damaging thing. It wasn't the court case itself. It was the way the media and politicians reported it that actually turned people against courts and against lawyers. And, you know, some of the language that was being used is destructive to our institutions and to trust in our institutions. And that was the most despicable part of what happened.
Speaking of the media, that was actually from the Daily Mail just before the ruling happened. And they had like the 3 pictures of the High Court members. I guess my question is what do you think is the role of the media in the way we perceive our law? Of course, I think different newspaper outlets have different ways of putting that forward. Do you think there's any way that it can be changed to ensure that the media tries to stay neutral, or even if it doesn't try to stay neutral, that it doesn't sort of perverse the way the legal procedures are happening?
Well, the first thing I'd ban is, we would propose, is no foreign ownership of our media. It is our media. Why should we have foreign ownership of it? The other thing is that the IPSO needs to be replaced. It's not a proper functioning regulatory body. And now with online, we have to figure out what we're going to do with online regulation when it comes to media, because, you know, a lot of the abuse I faced wasn't actually on the printed. I mean, yes, we had, you know, the reporting, which was very biased, and you had, you know, enemies of the people, and all of that happened. But actually online was the worst, with the abuse, because online articles that have comments underneath that basically, and all politicians suffer from this, and it has to be addressed. We can't expect good people to go into politics if every part of their lives are going to be outed and they're going to be literally, you know, hate bombed by actually media, by journalists on a regular basis. So I think the comment sections underneath that needs to be sorted out. I mean, the media claim that they haven't published it, so therefore they're not responsible. Well, they are publishers and they are responsible. So there's a lot of work to do there to clean up and make going into politics or even becoming an expert or a spokesperson, wherever you might end up working, you know, you have to be respected in a media space, and that's not happening.
Speaking of abuse, you've recently been a little bit outspoken about your interaction with Dominic Raab. I knew you were going to bring that up. I'm not sure if you're willing to share it, but I think my broader question here is there a way to effectively hold elected officials accountable in private settings? You mentioned putting the ministerial code into law.
Yes.
But do you think there are other ways of doing that? Because things can happen behind the scenes, and when it comes out, it becomes a thing of where people might not have the confidence to essentially say what's happened. And I think that was the case.
I mean, the thing is, believe it or not, the employment laws we would enjoy, anybody would enjoy, or even in an institution like this, the protections that you would enjoy actually don't apply to ministers. It's not just the civil servants, it's the ministerial staff, parliamentary staff have no ability, they're not protected by employment laws. They're not protected, and there are very few whistleblowing protections. We have to get a system in. I mean, one of the changes we're talking about, quite a lot of changes, but, you know, things like employment contracts for MPs. We elect and pay for them, and yet they have no contract of employment. They don't even have to turn up for surgeries. That's actually optional. You know, there's nothing they really have to do, even though we're paying them. So we believe that there should be strict rules of what they should do, what they can't do, almost a contract of employment, oath of law, but there has to be governance in place to protect those, because, as I said, the corridors of power can be very, when I use the word dangerous, I mean it, dangerous place to be, especially if you're a young person going in to work there as a SPAD or whatever it is. You have to have protections in place, and there has to be more transparency, more governance, more processes. So all of that needs to be strengthened.
Yeah, and in accordance with that, could you talk a bit about the Nolan principles? I always hear you talking about it on the media. How is putting that into effect going to change the way we hold our officials accountable?
Well, the way it works at the moment is the Nolan principles or code, the ministerial code, is just that. It's guidance. And the person who ultimately has yes, you stay, no, you go, is the Prime Minister. I mean, that just doesn't seem right. Look at what happened to Priti Patel. Look at what happened with Suella Braverman. Look what happened with Dominic Raab. It's just not right that it's the Prime Minister. There should be an independent body that's overlooking the code when it's put into law or on the statute. And that's not just for MPs. I believe that applies to all people in public office. So institutions, any public institution, regulators, those principles need to be put into law and are affected to anybody who's in public service or at the top of public institutions and regulators, because we have a deficit there. We have an accountability deficit that we do need to correct.
We've spoken a lot about elected officials, and at the beginning you mentioned them versus us. I wanted to sort of look at this more introspectively. What do you think is the difference between the sort of Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, them versus us, between the true and fair parties, them versus us?
So our policies, I'd say, our political stance is very different. So Reform Party, as many people, we meet people on doorstep who think it's a new party. It's actually 23 years old, because it was UKIP, and then it was Brexit Party, and then it was, Reform. So its provenance is there for quite some time. And they will be standing 500 candidates in the next general election and possibly win, because they're actually polling very similarly to the Lib Dems at the moment, which is something to just reflect on. Especially in the red wall seats, they're doing quite well, or very well. I'd say that the massive difference is that they are a right-wing, low-regulation, capitalist party on steroids. And we believe that, I believe in regulation. I believe that consumers should come first, that people should be protected. I believe in responsible capitalism. They believe in, as I say, free market on steroids. So that's the major difference.
More so, but in terms of like the people, the demographic you're trying to reach, would you say that you're trying to get more young people than compared to them? Are you looking at possibly women or ethnic minorities? Like, what is your demographic target?
So for all the polling and all the work that we've done, you've just hit all three groups. So we've discovered that a lot of under-25s feel that the parties don't represent them. They're not being heard, they're not being listened to, they're not being represented. Ethnic minority groups, women, lack of access to justice for women and children in our country is going backwards. You know, we thought, I started in '96 when I first started my first business, talking about the triple bottom line and what we called at that time, people, profit and planet. And we're still talking about that now. We still haven't got there. But what I thought we had done is that I thought we had moved the diversity dial. I thought we had actually got more rights. And what we've discovered is, and the stats are all showing it, is that culturally, socially, economically, there is huge unfairnesses and rolling back of actually fairness and a lot of the equality we thought we had achieved. We don't know necessarily, there isn't one thing that's caused this, but when we know that whenever there are economic challenges and there are financial crises, minority groups tend to bear the brunt of that, and we're seeing it again.
And on the topic of women, ethnic minorities, how has race and gender played a part in your politics and shaping to the person that you are today? In your book, Rise, you talk about how you had to drop out of university because of the discrimination that you faced. And I'm sure that's been perpetual from the start to where you are now in terms of your career. How does that sort of mold you as a person? And if there was a chance to change that, what are some of the ways? I know you've spoken about online changes, but what are some of the ways that us as young people can even sort of change those very bad stereotypes that people have about people of color or women?
Well, I think actually I've got a lot of hope in your generation because you're pushing back at a lot of what happened and the regression that we've seen. But me personally, a lot of people don't know this. People think that I'm fearless is something what people sometimes say. And I say, no, I'm fearful. I'm fearful for what happens when we don't speak up. Because for all the abuse and that I get and whatever it is, I'm not going to let those people own the oxygen in the conversation. So, of course, they don't realize that they fuel me to carry on. Rather than putting me off, it just means I'm not going to let them win, so I'm going to carry on. So I have a very perverse way of thinking. So they actually, because that's the alternative in my view, is that if we don't speak up, then those people who were, I'm afraid this is where I think we are, and it's not just in the UK, it's across the Western world. We are seeing a rise of the right, and actually it's interesting. I was saying earlier that the word post-truth entered the Oxford Dictionary in 2016 with Trump in America, with Brexit, with whatever was going on here. It's really interesting that the shifts happened around that time. And prior to that, we've always, in all societies, we've had extremists on the fringes of society. What has happened now, and I blame our leaders for this, is that they've been permitted to be part of the mainstream conversations and to be in the center rather than on the fringes. And I think that's what we have to fight back, and I think that's what you have to fight back for, is to say, no, we won't let this happen. We need to ensure that tolerance, compassion, courage, independence, all the things that we treasure as a society, that make the foundations that we walk on solid, are the things we have to fight for. And we have to push back. We have to push back, or else they win. And it's as simple as that. I mean, I think I'll share with you some of the things I experienced. I think over the years of both court cases, and I didn't just pop up from nowhere. One of the things people say is, oh, you popped up from nowhere doing these court cases. And I say it took me 30 years to pop up from nowhere. Because just to share with you, in answer to your question, some of the things that I've experienced as a woman of color is that, so you've read, I don't know if any of you have read recently, but the idea that there was a report saying that ethnic minority women, mothers that go into maternity ward, actually are hugely discriminated. Their outcomes are much, much worse. And actually that happened to me. So that's when I first became an activist, a true activist, because my eldest daughter, who will be 35 on the 7th of May, when she was born, she was starved of oxygen because the hospital I was in would not listen to me. I knew something was wrong, but they wouldn't listen. And so she wasn't saved, she wasn't given the care that she needed, I wasn't given the care I was needed. So she has a lifetime sentence of being disabled, of having special needs. And that could have been saved if they had listened to me. And my first battle was I tried to get the hospital, and I lost that battle. I tried to get my records and her records published so that we could see what was going on in hospitals, and I failed in that. But when she reached school age, at that time, so we're talking 35, well, no, then it would have been, she was 32 years ago, that statements, special needs support in schools, wasn't available for everybody. You had to have money, you had to have specialist consulting reports, doctors' reports. You had to have an awful lot of money to get proper access to support. And I felt that that was totally unjust, that every child, every parent should have the right to access so their child could be the best that they could be. And that's when I started fighting for her. And the result of that fight is I actually drafted legislation, a part of the 1996 Education Act, which made special needs governors of school have to provide that provision. So that came from a very personal place, a personal experience of mine, suffering from the system and having to experience what that was like. And I just felt that was unjust, that I had to go through that and that other women had to go through that. My next one, which also is along those lines, is in March 2015, the Modern Day Slavery Act got royal assent, and that was a huge amount of work that I got involved in that, because sitting in a park with my then child, younger child, I sat next to this woman who kept staring at my son, really, and I was really worried because I thought something's wrong. And she trusted me after a few visits to the park, and I found out that she had been trafficked here. Her passport had been taken away, and that my son looked like her son that she hadn't seen for about 8 or 9 years. And then I discovered in London that there were all these women and girls being trafficked for domestic servitude. And that's where that act and the work I started doing with that started. So I haven't always gone out of my way to find battles to fight. If I see something that's wrong, and that's the one thing I would share, if you see something that's wrong around you, you don't have to have a big idea. It's something that you see. You can actually start in your own backyard sometimes. Actually, it's the best place to start, somewhere where you have an experience and you can actually do something that helps other people.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Final question before I hand over to the audience. I wanted to ask, you've spoken about university reforms that you want to have, so lowering the tuition fees from 9,000 to 7,500. What are some of the, you've mentioned there's a review that you've mentioned that you want to implement for that to happen. Could you talk a bit about that review and how that will benefit students in the long run?
Well, it's got a lot of student reforms that we're looking at. If I start from sort of younger children who then go up to university, is that we weirdly are one of the few countries that has 3 terms. And the reason we have that, and we have this long summer holiday, even though all the data and statistics show that that's when children are groomed, it's when they get approached by gang members, when they're neglected by parents. There's a lot of negative things that happen in that term, in that long summer holiday, which was a long summer holiday so children could help bring in the crops. Post-Brexit, they might need to go back out and bring in the crops, but right now they should be in school. And so one of the things we're talking about is to bring in a 4th term, but to make it non-academic, to make it a sensory term, where you do art, music, drama, to make you a strong individual. It's about confidence, it's about making, because this idea that all you need to learn is academia, that does not make you a rounded person and does not make you able to contribute to innovation, to lateral thinking. So we want to bring in a sensory term that does that, 6-week term, that is all about you. For young people. Also, the data, because a lot of what we're doing is based on the data. We're not perception or outlier data, but looking at data and looking and speaking to experts and practitioners. And a lot of the headmasters and teachers are telling us that we're losing young people at 13. They're losing the real, sort of energy and inspiration they get from learning. Our data on GCSE and maths, I know Rishi Sunak keeps talking about maths, but it's English as well. We have some really dire figures of low pass rates. And we have to do something, and all the evidence we're getting is that you need to inspire people at 13, not 16. So we're talking about a different way of doing maths, so bringing in practical subjects from 13, so that if you decided that academia is not for you, you can go into coding, or you can go into art, or you can go into mentoring, whatever it is, your skills you want to do in practical maths, practical English. So we're actually looking at a completely different curriculum from 13 as well. From university, we think to attract the best and brightest to work in public services, NHS, civil service, etc. After 5 years, if you work for more than 5 years in a public institution or public service, then your your loan would be wiped out. So we would it would be eradicated if you stay in public service for 5 years, because we think that's a way of attracting the keeping people here and making sure that they become part of a stronger future for us. But it's only right if you're giving public service. Why should you have that debt hanging over your head at now soon to be 9%? It's totally ridiculous.
Thank you, Gina, for sharing everything you have so far. Does anyone have any questions? Over there. Oh.
I think it would have to be the constitution of that independent body would actually, we think, should be a makeup of citizens plus experts plus judiciary. We wouldn't be from one, and not sitting judiciary or sitting politicians. So you think some people would have to know. That's one of the things we'd put out to an inquiry. That's why we said we want an inquiry to look at this. And I think it's really important in lots of these issues that we're talking about, such as electoral reform, ministerial code, that we actually do include citizens' assemblies. I think we have to close the gap between citizens and politics. Yeah, I mean, the trust deficit is so wide now that I think we do have to find a way of bringing people into the process. Ooh, gosh, hello. You're all the way up there.
Earlier, you spoke about very ambitious programs of possible reforms, but also about the horrific individual effect that politicians suffer from the current state of Armenia. Do you feel that many of the ideas which you presented are at all possible without some change in the British press? And do you think that will actually happen?
Well, I think the window of opportunity, which is another reason why I went or decided on the True and Fair Party, thank you for that question right now, is that not only is voter sentiment different, but there is a very strong possibility that the outcome of the next election will be a hung parliament. And with a hung parliament, individual voices and issues become much more amplified. And if you look at what happened when Lib Dems went into coalition, they would lose most of their members, I think, if they went into coalition again. So there is an opportunity. And one of the things we've done, and this is including Reform UK, because I do speak to everybody. I think it's important we speak to everybody. We have all agreed, bar the two main parties, that electoral reforms are red line. And all of us have agreed it, because it's obviously in our interest. But by doing that, it means that whoever it is that goes into government, we don't know. But the stats, the true stats, not what you're reading in the polling and some of the papers, is showing that we really are looking at a hung parliament. And at that stage, we could propose things. And one of the other things we've been discussing cross-party is the ending of foreign ownership of media. We think it's very important. And so do others.
David Grace.
I'm a Liberal, so I won't be surprised that I agree with a lot of what you've said. But you have got me worried. Are you going to put up candidates against Liberals in the election? Because we need every vote we can get to beat the Conservatives. And the other thing I want to ask you, a lot of the things that you care about and I care about have traditionally depended upon convention, people behaving like gentlemen, and we know how well that's worked. Are you also in favour of a written constitution? Thank you.
Thank you. Two very good questions. So yes, we are standing candidates. I'm standing in Epsom and Newell against Chris Grayling. We have 7 candidates at the moment, and we probably have another 5. All the seats we've chosen are outside of Labour's top 150 targets and outside the Lib Dems' top 50. So, for example, next to me is Monica Harding, who I think will definitely win against Rahab this time. You've got Sutton, which I think you'll win as well. And so it'll be me, hopefully, in a sea of Lib Dems. We've been very careful in the seats we've chosen there's a high proportion of what I call one nation Tories in the seats that we've chosen who do not see the Conservatives as their party. So my pitch to all the opposition parties is let's all focus on our target seats, because then we get a proper win, if you like, a solid win. In answer to your second question, I don't think we have time to debate a written constitution. It would take how many years? How do we decide what's in it? I'm much more, that's why I believe in the route of we do almost a semi-codified constitution, which is ministerial code into law, prorogation powers into law, reform of the House of Lords. So we can do things that I suppose in essence, are putting some of those things into a codified format. But I don't think we will get to where do we even begin on a written constitution? It's a huge task. And so much is broken now. I think there is more urgency. There are things we can do. Because one of the other things I think is sometimes, it's we don't have to change everything to signal a change in culture. And when you said about how things have gone, the good chap, principles have gone out the window, we need to have cultural change. I think that it is unacceptable for people to behave in a certain way. And I think if we have some of those changes, it will signpoint a cultural shift, I'm hoping.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah, come to yours. Yeah, please.
Was there ever a point during your two cases that you thought that Brexit might not actually?
No, well, one is the referendum was a vote for Brexit, and both cases, it was never about, it couldn't stop it. Neither case could stop Brexit. And the first case, we were very careful in Miller 1 that our timetable didn't interrupt the government's timetable, because the government's timetable was for January, and we made sure. I mean, I cannot tell you, my team, my legal team, they slept on the floor and worked night and day to get that case through in the timetable, the government's timetable. So we actually asked the government what their timetable was to make sure that we didn't frustrate it. So no, it was making sure that it wasn't done in an illegal way, because just one point I want to make on this is often lost. Article 50, to trigger us leaving the EU, it says in it, the 126 words in it, but it basically says that you have to leave, any departing member has to leave along the lines of their constitutional requirements. And our constitutional requirements is that it went before Parliament. Now, if we hadn't done that and we had have just left, the EU was debating whether we then became a pariah state, because we would have broken both domestic and international law, and nobody really quite knew what that meant. The problem with Article 50, even though we British lawyers drafted it, is that it was really more of an ornament than an instrument. It was actually never meant to be used. It wasn't a very well-written bit of law, so it needed clarification. But there was a lot of talk about what happens to the UK if we actually did go ahead. So it needed that clarification.
Thank you. One of your party's promises was to mandate voting for those over a certain age. Two questions on that. The first, how does that relate to people's ability to selectively participate in democracy, or arguably is a part of democracy to choose not to vote? How do you think that interacts with people's individual liberties in that regard? And secondly, how would you go about enforcing that? Would it be via fines? Would it become a criminal offence not to vote? Practically, how would that work? And would things like, for example, spoiling ballots, would that also be going against your mandate to vote? So practically, how does it work? And
So your right to spoil your ballot is part of that right. So we'd say that as long as you do that, and the closest model we've looked at is the Australian model. So the Australian model is one that's it's a compulsory participatory process. And from everywhere we've looked at, that seems to be the fairest. But again, we would put that out to a public debate about it, a citizen assembly on it. Personally, for me, the right to strike off or spoil your ballot is also a democratic right.
I was just wondering, you spoke about like danger of power. Following on from like the Miller cases, do you think that the courts have appropriately fulfilled their role in providing checks and balances? Like, obviously, your cases are about the separation of powers. Do you think, following on from that, the changes that you hope to see has come about?
I think the courts are very nervous now because of how they were politicized. So it's not the question of, and we've seen it now with the, lefty lawyers that they're being called for standing up for asylum seekers, and also for Shamima Begum was a perfect case. That's the role of the courts. But the way they're being politicized, they are very nervous. I speak to a lot of judges and lots of lawyers who are very worried about the way our present Home Secretary talks about the courts and justice, and it's not new. This is not the politicizing of courts, the rule of law, separation of powers is actually a playbook for most populist movements. And trying to attack judges it's as I say, it's sort of like the Janet and John playbook of populism, but it's very dangerous, and we have to try and. I worry on two levels. One is the rhetoric. But I also worry that there are some opportunists who are knocking on the court's doors too much, because by doing it too often, you are actually going to make the courts go, no, we just won't accept it. And on judicial review, when the government tried to ban Boris Johnson in particular, I call it his Revenge Act, because he didn't want anyone else to bring a judicial review. He took it so personally that I'd taken a case against him. But it's more difficult. It's much more difficult now under the Courts Act to actually bring a case.
Over. Mike is there.
In previous questions, but my question is, in such a strong two-party system, how do you propose your party will achieve any meaningful change in a system designed to oppress minority parties, particularly when discussing such big-picture issues?
Because I think there's an opportunity now with the hung parliament, with the sentiment of people saying we won't vote for any of the above. We've not really seen this atmosphere. Traveling around the country last year, from Yorkshire to Leeds to wherever we did, I think 30-odd tours or something, but we've never heard the them and us like we're hearing at the moment. They're all the same. There is a shift in voter sentiment. People are not behaving as tribally as they have done in the past. They're looking for something different. And if we can activate some of those who are in that disenfranchised, politically homeless, won't vote for anybody, we want change, but we don't want the policies, if you like, then we can make real change. For me, success is even if we get this debate on the table, not just winning seats. I mean, we'll try to win seats. I understand how difficult it is. But we're going to try. And I just think this is the opportunity, this is the time when we can try. And if we can persuade those parties, as I said earlier, to just stick to their target seats and actually be sensible and actually do tactical voting in its proper sense, then you do have a chance of bringing in, someone said, who is it that you look up to? For me, it's Caroline Lucas banging on about the environment every single day for the entire her career. It's now mainstream politics. So if I can get into Parliament, or a couple of us can, and we can bang on about electoral change and modernising the machinery of government every day, then it becomes mainstream. Why shouldn't there be checks and balances on MPs, just like all of us? They should follow the same rules the rest of us have to follow if we go into any place of work. That's all we're asking for.
We'll go there and there. Yeah, if you
can. First of all, thank you for speaking here today. I was just wondering, in the context of growing fear of disenfranchisement, what are your views regarding the requirement to show ID when voting?
Oh, simple. It's a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Because oddly, the stats that show that the very small amount of voter fraud that happened was actually in postal votes. And this doesn't affect that, which is crazy. So you've got 2 million people who are going to be disenfranchised. Actually, what's very worrying is that today is the deadline, and less than half of the people actually have it. For what we don't know for certain, but it looks like there's a huge number of people who don't have it. And in the last by-election, we know that lots of people turned up and weren't aware that they had to have voter ID. And then I think it's blatant playing the generations against each other. How can you possibly have a bus pass for one age group, but you can't have a student pass for the other age group? And it is disenfranchising a huge number of vulnerable and young people, and I think it's wrong. And it's just, and when people say, oh, but we have church in other countries, whatever, we're not talking about other countries, we're talking about here. So it was definitely done in a manner that is to assist the Tories and solve a problem that doesn't exist.
There's been a directional shift in judgments made by the Supreme Court since Lady Hale left, who famously took a very liberal approach to judicial review. Since who, sorry? Since? Lady Hale.
Lady Hale.
The Supreme Court.
I think they're being... Lady Hale did not make a liberal... it was a unanimous vote, so it wasn't Lady Hale's vote. If she was the only person who had done, then you could have accused her of that. The judgment is very sound. And actually, what's very strange in both Miller cases is that actually they're textbook Year 1 constitutional law cases. They're not actually that difficult at all. The actual principles of law are pretty simple. You know, and the fact that the government didn't put up any evidence, or it shows that they knew that. So they're not difficult constitutional cases, and so the court didn't have any problem ruling on them. But I think it's, going back to what I said earlier, they're worried about the politicizing of the courts and the way it's, and they're being very cautious. I was really, just to counter that, I was really intrigued by Adam Tolley's report into Mr. Raab, because I thought he wasn't going to be quite as legal as he, or as strident as he was. And this whole example of politicizing, for Mr. Raab to now say that there's a new low bar set for civil servants, and for, you know, the bar was set by the High Court in 2021, and that's a bar he was judged by and found guilty by. There is no new bar, there is already a bar. So that's an example of him trying to politicize, you know, not just a lawyer, but also a court ruling. So I think we have to be very careful, but the courts are nervous. They are nervous.
To the second of your cases for a moment, do you not think, whatever you think about the law, whether the law was right or wrong, that the Supreme Court fundamentally mistook parliamentary sovereignty for parliamentary scrutiny, in that whilst there are many cases throughout the year when Parliament does not sit, but we would not say that Parliament is not sovereign. You know, the authority of the Crown in Parliament is still there. What the issue that was at stake here was that Parliament was not sitting, and therefore was not adequate parliamentary scrutiny. So the premise of the case, which was that that sovereignty was infringed upon, doesn't necessarily make sense in the context of there are many examples of where Parliament's not sitting, but Parliament's still sovereign. The issue is actually parliamentary scrutiny, not parliamentary sovereignty.
No, that's the wrong issue, because it wasn't. Recess is a normal part of our parliamentary system. Prorogation is a normal part of our constitutional system. But if it's for the purposes to shut down Parliament, that is not. And so closing it down for 5 weeks, so then we went past the 31st of October, so the Benn Act could not be used, and we would have left with no deal, was illegal. And it was the purpose of the prorogation that the case was about. It wasn't about the act of prorogation.
Just over
there. Obviously, both your cases have brought a lot of attention to judicial review. And like you said, there was a lot of hostility from certain people like Johnson and other members of government and Parliament. And don't imagine that anybody would go so far as to totally ban judicial review. But I can imagine a situation where it might be so many restrictions imposed upon it that it becomes a redundant instrument. As somebody who's on the inside, how close are we to that sort of situation? And if it were to happen, what can we realistically do to reverse that process?
Well, I'll waylay your fears, because in some of those acts that got royal assent last year, April last year, they did try to bring in clauses or include in the laws, in the bills, clauses that made them non-justiciable, and they were struck down because they realized that you can't do that, because basically what you would have done if those clauses were included is that they'd all be in court. you'd actually end up with more cases in court trying to go against the act or actually question the acts as whether they were legal, going back to the fundamental fact of Magna Carta, so that they actually took them all out. So that didn't happen. They did try, but it didn't happen. And I think the thing is with judicial review, and I think the government, any government who believes in scrutiny, should allow, obviously, judicial review. And if you look at the data, the government, most of the time in judicial review, the government wins. So it's actually, they should want judicial review, because in the majority of cases, they are proven right. So this whole idea that it overturns lots of decisions for public bodies and institutions or government, it's not true. The data doesn't bear that out.
Yes. Back to your discussion of Lords reform. Something that I found quite striking, despite the fact that obviously are issues with things such as hereditary peers and the problems that exist, that during these sort of constitutional crises that we've spoken about, so the prorogation of Parliament, the triggering of Article 50, and now arguably the supposed introduction of a British Bill of Rights that seems to threaten similar things. Lots of members of the House of Lords have actually been the ones to step up and call the government out on these things. Is that a role that you would like to preserve, sort of in spite of the reforms that you're also suggesting?
Absolutely, and that confirms my belief that they are an oversight legislative chamber, because that is what they're there to do, is to actually protect and make sure that governments are not bringing in laws that are actually damaging to society, to sectors, to business. I mean, they do this all the time. And the fact it's got a lot of judges and lawyers in there means that they're able to do the job, which is why I go back to the fact that, you know, if you look at halving it, a lot of the people who are put up there as, you know, peerages for prizes for cronyism or favoritism and support, I don't think patronage shouldn't be part of that process. That one you'd like to know, that we say that any prime minister who's been in office less than 2 years can't actually do a nomination list. Well, so it's the sort of things we're talking about as well. So I think it's really important that they stay up there and that they do that role. And actually, you're quite right. They've been the ones. Actually, I've been doing a lot of work for 3 years now on the online safety bill. And that has been really interesting, looking at the debates in the Lords and the Commons and what's gone back and forth on that.
Hi, thank you. You briefly went over the Ulster clauses in Acts of Parliament with the previous question. I was going to ask, in the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act of 2022, the purported exercise of the act was also deemed non-justiciable. Do you think that that provides a blueprint for future legislation and creates an act that cannot actually be justiciable?
They would like to do that. I think they'd like to put that in every single act to make sure that it's not justiciable, but I just don't think they're going to get away with it, especially when it involves rights. They are going on the statute book, and I do worry that the Bill of Rights, if it ever gets through, but Mr. Rabb and the backbenchers may, or not in ministerial posts, maybe it won't now. But there are other things to worry about that are coming down the line. We'll have to wait and see. But hopefully they won't be in power soon, so they won't be able to bring them in. But again, I go back to my point, it doesn't matter who's in power. No government should be able to do that, I don't think. That's why we need electoral change.
I'll take two more. We'll go here and here. Can we do the questions together and then answer more?
One of the drawbacks of not having a written constitution is that any government can undo the actions of a previous government, which means that any promises made by governments are totally worthless. What's your view on that, and what do you think should be done about it?
It's a really important question, because especially talking about future issues that are coming down the road, big seismic changes that are going to happen to society, to work on a 3 to 5 year, it's actually really a 3-year cycle, because they spend 2 years and just figuring out what they're going to put in the next manifesto. You know, you can't, those short-term policy solutions to really huge issues, is a big problem. And I think what I'd like to see is we get to a place where we start talking about ring-fencing certain areas of policy, such as defence, such as the NHS, that we don't, the areas that are outside the football, the political football that we get. And I think, but then I go back again to let's get rid of first past the post, because if you have a system where you don't have majority governments in the same way, then there has to be collaboration and there's much more give and take. And then you end up with much more longevity in policy. And that you've seen it around the world. So that's one of the reasons when I think, and when I say that, I'm talking about things like obviously climate change, but also the digital revolution that we're going through, aging of the population, commodity shortages. You know, we are facing the possibility that the next biggest crisis is water in not so long a time. So, you know, we can't make these short-term policies anymore.
Yeah, someone with that. No, go first and then... Yeah.
I think there was two of us, but thank you for being here tonight. I'm curious, where is your party seeking its inspiration? Is it looking to other states? For example, your education reforms sound almost German. Where are you seeking your inspiration? Thank you.
All around the world. So our procurement, we're looking really closely at Norway on procurement because they've done some amazing things. When we look, believe it or not, we were just talking about it this morning about the PBO, which is the Parliamentary Budgetary Office, which is in Australia. So every party, including an independent party, has to submit its proposal manifesto to an independent office that then actually looks at what the costings will be. And that's then published to the entire population. So, I mean, something like that, that's incredible, isn't it, to be able to do that? As I said, even an independent candidate can actually submit their manifesto for costing. I mean, here we have the IFS, and everyone's always on their seat waiting to see what Paul Johnson says. But, you know, and that's including the budget. So we are looking at inspiration around the world. But, yeah, we can't possibly be... But at the same time, you have to be mindful of we are not the rest of the world. So, for example, whenever I hear the government talking about Singapore on Thames, we're not Singapore. We don't have the culture. We don't have that sort of government. We're not. So you can't just transport things. You have to look at how they apply to our particular population. And one of the challenges is our north-south divide, because we have the biggest north-south divide of any European country. And so that is challenging when you're bringing in national. So one of the big things we have to look at all of this is also the sort of regional implications of national policy that we're suggesting and how that works with local government, etc. So, but we look everywhere.
Does the person still want to ask a question over there?
Hi there.
Given like the political climate, do you think there's sentiment for sort of new age education, like the sensory sort of fourth term that you were talking about? How would you market that to the public if there isn't public sentiment for that at the moment?
Well, we talk to parents, to students, to pediatric mental health services, to police. So we know that this is something that actually stakeholders who we've spoken to love the idea, because there's so much. People are very worried about the mental health of our young people, and this whole concentration on academia and what I call mantelpiece children is you have to have a certificate on a mantelpiece for you to be worth anything. And the focus on that is really damaging to mental health and well-being. So we speak to the stakeholders, not just experts, because experts can also fall out with each other, especially academic experts. So stakeholders and practitioners are a very important part of the people we test our ideas on as well.
I'm going to round up the questions here. I have a final question. One of your party's proposals is to ban the sale of alcohol in the House of Commons.
Can I tell you, that's not going down well.
Well, that was my question. How do you think members of Parliament will react to such a...
There's a couple of them they don't like. So that's one they don't like. And the other one they don't like is to say that they have to sit more often, because they only sit for 33 weeks a year. So they don't like the idea that we're saying they have to actually be in Parliament more often. Yeah, that one went down well. And then my comeback is, so tell me which other place of employment has alcohol at every bar? There are not many. You have your rooms where you have dinners and you have, bank, whatever it is. So those rooms can still have alcohol. But the fact it's just there for everyone to walk into. And unfortunately, it's a place where a lot of the bad behavior happens. And we know that from a lot of the women I speak to in Parliament, a lot of the young people, a lot of the spats, alcohol fuels a lot of the bad behavior. And that's the other reason why it's a very serious issue.
Well, Gina, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. I've had an absolute pleasure interviewing you. Please join me in a round of applause for Gina.